April 16, 1945, 20 meters above the Bavarian countryside. The whistle of wind through the P-51 Mustang's gun ports merged with the howl of the Packard Merlin engine as First Lieutenant James Callahan pushed his fighter into a dive that brought him level with the spring wheat, so close that the prop wash bent the green stalks in violent waves behind him. At 400 miles per hour, the Bavarian landscape became a blur of emerald fields, red-roofed farmhouses, and the silver thread of a canal that would guide him to his target. Ahead, barely visible above the tree line, rose a plume of black smoke, coal smoke from the locomotive of a German freight train attempting to move ammunition and supplies to Wehrmacht units still fighting their desperate rearguard actions in the collapsing Third Reich. Callahan's finger rested on the trigger for the 6 50-caliber machine guns mounted in his wings, each weapon loaded with a belt of ammunition, mixing armor-piercing incendiaries with high-explosive rounds. The sound that dominated his consciousness was not the engine's roar or the wind's scream, but his own breathing through the oxygen mask, measured and controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Each breath marked the seconds until engagement, until he would pull up slightly to clear the last stand of pine trees and emerge with guns blazing onto a railway line where a German freight train had nowhere to hide, and no defense against the machine diving toward it at speeds no ground observer could track effectively. The locomotive appeared as Callahan cleared the trees, its Victorian ironwork and driving wheels now serving a military desperate enough to move supplies in daylight despite Allied air supremacy. He pressed the trigger. The Mustang shuddered as all 6 machine guns opened fire in unison, their combined sound like canvas tearing at industrial volume, their muzzle flashes visible even in daylight. The bullets walked up the railway ballast, stitched across the locomotive's boiler, and shattered the cab, where the engineer had perhaps 1 second to comprehend the fighter materializing from impossible angles, before 50-caliber rounds traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second transformed steel and flesh into wreckage. Steam erupted from the ruptured boiler as Callahan flashed overhead, banking hard to come around for another pass at the freight cars behind the dying locomotive. This was not the aerial combat that had made fighter pilots into popular heroes. No dogfights against enemy fighters at altitude, no formation battles with honor-bound rules of engagement, no opportunity for adversaries to demonstrate skill in matched combat. This was something more brutal and more decisive, armed reconnaissance at altitudes where a moment's inattention meant flying into a tree or power line. Attacks on ground targets that could not fight back effectively, but whose destruction crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain combat operations. This was fighter aviation transformed into a systematic campaign against enemy logistics, turning the Luftwaffe's own heartland into a free-fire zone where nothing could move by day without being seen, targeted, and destroyed by American fighters that ruled the skies so completely they could afford to fly at treetop level, hunting individual trucks and trains. The sound of Callahan's machine guns, that distinctive ripping roar of 50-caliber Brownings firing in concert, would become the audio signature of the Allied air campaign's final phase, the systematic destruction of Germany's transportation infrastructure by fighters freed from defensive duties because the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies. That sound echoed across Germany in the war's final months, announcing to soldiers and civilians alike that American air power had achieved such complete dominance that fighters could operate at will, at any altitude, attacking targets large and small with the certainty that German air defenses could not prevent them. The machine gun's roar was the sound of logistical strangulation, of military force being systematically deprived of the supplies, fuel, and ammunition necessary for continued resistance, of an industrial war being won through the unglamorous but decisive tactic of destroying the enemy's ability to move resources from production to consumption. To understand why American fighter pilots adopted ultra-low altitude tactics in 1944-1945, one must first comprehend the evolution of Allied air strategy and the transformation of the air war over Europe. American entry into the European air war in 1942 had begun with ambitious strategic bombing doctrine, the belief that heavy bombers operating in daylight could destroy Germany's industrial capacity, that precision bombing of economic targets would cripple the Nazi war machine, and that air power alone might make ground invasion unnecessary. This doctrine quickly met the brutal realities of German air defenses, Luftwaffe fighters that inflicted catastrophic losses on unescorted bomber formations, and flak concentrations that made even successful bombing runs devastatingly costly. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, beginning in late 1943, transformed the strategic situation. The Mustang combined range sufficient to escort bombers deep into Germany with performance exceeding most Luftwaffe fighters, finally providing American heavy bombers with the protection they desperately needed. Through the first half of 1944, American fighters waged systematic war against the Luftwaffe, engaging German fighters over Germany itself, forcing combat on terms that favored American numerical superiority and pilot training quality, and inflicting losses the Luftwaffe could not replace. By D-Day in June 1944, Allied air superiority was effectively established. The Luftwaffe could still mount operations, but it could no longer prevent Allied aircraft from dominating European skies. This air superiority created opportunities for expanded fighter missions. Escort duty remained important, but increasing numbers of fighters could be released for other tasks as the Luftwaffe threat diminished. American commanders recognized that fighters possessed capabilities extending far beyond air-to-air combat. Their speed and maneuverability made them effective ground attack platforms. Their range allowed them to operate deep in German territory. Their armament, 6 50-caliber machine guns on the P-51, 8 on the P-47 Thunderbolt, plus bombs and rockets when carried, could destroy or damage a wide range of ground targets. Most importantly, their availability in large numbers meant that systematic campaigns against ground targets could be conducted without compromising primary air superiority missions. The decision to emphasize armed reconnaissance and ground attack missions reflected hard-headed strategic calculation. Heavy bombers, despite enormous effort and terrible casualties, had not achieved the decisive economic paralysis that pre-war doctrine had promised. German industrial production remained robust through 1944, recovering from attacks with disturbing speed. But German military effectiveness depended not just on production, but on transportation, on the ability to move raw materials to factories, to distribute finished weapons to military units, to supply frontline forces with ammunition and fuel, and to shift military resources to threatened sectors. Germany's transportation network, particularly its railways, represented a target set whose destruction would have immediate military impact by severing connections between production and consumption, between resources and the forces needing them. Attacking transportation infrastructure required different tactics than strategic bombing of fixed industrial targets. Marshalling yards and major rail junctions could be targeted by heavy bombers, and were, but the railway network was vast and redundant. Destroying major nodes disrupted traffic temporarily, but did not prevent movement through alternate routes. More effective was systematic harassment of transportation throughout the network, forcing Germans to abandon daytime movement, destroying locomotives and rolling stock faster than they could be replaced, and making every attempted supply movement risky and potentially lethal. This kind of harassment required aircraft that could hunt mobile targets across wide areas, that could operate at low altitudes where targets were visible, and that could attack with sufficient precision to destroy or damage individual vehicles and trains. Fighter aircraft were ideal for this mission, but it required them to operate in ways that contradicted earlier tactical doctrine. Traditional fighter tactics emphasized altitude advantage, height translated to energy, energy to tactical options, and maintaining altitude superiority over opponents was fundamental to air combat effectiveness. But hunting ground targets required fighters to operate at low altitude, where targets were visible and where terrain features could be used for approach concealment. This meant deliberately surrendering the altitude advantage, accepting vulnerability to ground fire, and flying in environments where pilot error could be instantly fatal. The decision to adopt these tactics on systematic basis represented recognition that, with air superiority achieved, the greatest contribution fighters could make was disrupting enemy logistics, even at the cost of increased losses to ground fire and accidents. The P-51 Mustang proved particularly suitable for low-altitude armed reconnaissance despite being designed primarily as an escort fighter for high-altitude operations. Its Packard Merlin engine maintained good performance at low altitude. Its 650 caliber machine guns provided effective firepower against ground targets. Its long range allowed it to operate deep in German territory, hunting targets far from Allied front lines. Its relatively light wing loading and responsive controls made it maneuverable at low altitude, critical for avoiding terrain and engaging targets that appeared suddenly. Most importantly, it was available in large numbers as escort requirements decreased. By early 1945, hundreds of P-51s could be committed to armed reconnaissance missions without compromising bomber protection. Lieutenant Callahan had transitioned to low-altitude operations in January 1945 after flying escort missions throughout late 1944. The tactical shift required relearning fundamental flying skills. Navigation at altitude could be done by reference to distant landmarks and radio navigation aids, but at treetop level, the world became a blur of terrain features rushing past at speeds that left seconds for identification and decision-making. Spatial awareness had to be absolute, with pilot attention divided between scanning for targets, monitoring altitude and airspeed, checking for obstacles and terrain features, and maintaining formation position relative to other aircraft in the flight. The margin for error was non-existent. At 400 miles per hour and 20 meters altitude, a moment's distraction or a slight control misjudgment meant flying into the ground or a tree or a power line with results that were invariably fatal. The training emphasized target identification and engagement procedures. Pilots learned to distinguish military targets from civilian vehicles, though this distinction often blurred in practice as Germany mobilized every available vehicle for military transport. They practiced attack runs against ground targets, learning optimal angles and ranges for gun and rocket attacks, understanding how different targets required different tactics, and developing the timing necessary to engage targets during the brief seconds when they were in firing position. They studied German railway equipment, learned to identify ammunition trains by their distinctive car types, and memorized the locations of German supply depots, marshalling yards, and transportation choke points. But no amount of training fully prepared pilots for the psychological experience of ultra-low altitude combat operations. Flying at treetop level produced sensations of speed and exposure that high-altitude flight did not generate. At 20,000 feet, the landscape below seemed abstract, miniaturized, removed from immediate danger. At 20 meters, the landscape was viscerally present. Trees and buildings and power lines were obstacles requiring split-second maneuvers. The ground was close enough to see individual details, and the sensation was less like flying than like driving a sports car at impossible speeds through terrain not designed for vehicular passage. The psychological stress was acute, demanding constant alertness, producing exhaustion that accumulated over missions and creating fear that pilots had to master through professionalism and mutual support within their units. The targets that Callahan and thousands of other American fighter pilots hunted across Germany in early 1945 represented the Wehrmacht's logistical lifelines: locomotives pulling freight cars loaded with ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and equipment, trucks moving supplies on roads where railways had been destroyed, barges on canals transporting coal and raw materials, staff cars carrying officers and communications between headquarters. The target set was vast and distributed, impossible to defend comprehensively, vulnerable to systematic interdiction by fighters that could range across Germany hunting anything that moved. Each successful attack destroyed not just the immediate target, but created broader disruption. Destroyed locomotives meant trains could not run, burning trucks blocked roads, damaged bridges forced detours, and the cumulative effect was transportation paralysis that left German military units without the supplies necessary for sustained operations. The sound of Callahan's machine guns destroying that Bavarian locomotive represented a tactical moment in a strategic campaign. The locomotive itself was not strategically significant. Germany had thousands of locomotives, and losing one did not fundamentally alter the military balance. But multiply that attack by hundreds of similar engagements daily, extended across months of sustained operations, and the cumulative effect was catastrophic for German logistics. By April 1945, German railways were operating at a fraction of pre-war capacity. Daytime train movements had become suicidal. Locomotives and rolling stock were being destroyed faster than damaged equipment could be repaired. The Wehrmacht's supply situation had deteriorated to the point where frontline units operated with ammunition stocks measured in hours rather than days, where fuel shortages immobilized armor formations and where troops went hungry because food could not be transported from supply depots to combat units. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by losses of aircraft and experienced pilots, found itself unable to protect Germany's transportation infrastructure. Defending railways and roads against fighter attacks required standing patrols over vulnerable areas, intercepting fighters before they could attack, and accepting combat on terms that favored the attackers. German fighters attempting these missions faced overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Allied fighters operated in groups of 4, 8, 16 or more aircraft, mutually supporting, able to engage ground targets, while other aircraft provided top cover against interference. German fighters, scrambling to intercept, found themselves outnumbered, outperformed by aircraft like the P-51 and P-47, and frequently shot down before they could engage the fighter bombers attacking ground targets below. German anti-aircraft defenses provided the primary opposition to low-altitude fighter attacks, but these defenses were inadequate against fast-moving targets appearing suddenly from terrain masking. Light flak, 20 mm and 37 mm guns could engage low-flying aircraft effectively if positioned along known approach routes and if crews had adequate warning. But fighters attacking at treetop level appeared suddenly, attacked quickly, and were gone before sustained anti-aircraft engagement was possible. Positioning flak guns to defend every section of railway, every road, every potential target was impossible, given the distances involved and the limited availability of anti-aircraft units increasingly needed for defending cities and industrial facilities against heavy bombers. The Wehrmacht found itself in an impossible defensive situation. Its transportation infrastructure was essential for continued military operations, but could not be effectively defended against an enemy who controlled the skies and could attack at will. The psychological impact on German troops and civilians was profound. The constant sound of American fighters overhead, the visible destruction of locomotives and vehicles, the knowledge that nothing could move safely during daylight hours, all contributed to a sense that defeat was inevitable regardless of continued battlefield resistance. German soldiers in combat units watched their ammunition supplies dwindle, their fuel tanks run dry, and their logistics chains disintegrate not because of enemy ground action, but because American fighters had made resupply impossible. The Wehrmacht's vaunted operational mobility, which had enabled blitzkrieg successes early in the war, had been reduced to nighttime movement on secondary roads, hoping to avoid detection and praying that the sounds of Allied aircraft overhead did not presage the sudden violence of a strafing attack. For Callahan and his fellow fighter pilots, the experience of low-altitude operations was a mixture of exhilaration, fear, and moral ambiguity. The flying itself was thrilling in ways that high-altitude escort missions were not. Operating at extreme low altitude, threading through terrain at high speed, engaging targets with immediate visible results. The fear was constant and rational. Every mission involved sustained exposure to ground fire, risk of collision with terrain or obstacles, and the knowledge that mechanical failure or pilot error at low altitude meant certain death with no opportunity to bail out safely. The moral ambiguity came from the nature of the targets and the methods of engagement. Attacking trains and trucks felt less clean than aerial combat against enemy fighters. The line between military and civilian targets blurred in practice, and the violence visited on crews of attacked vehicles was immediate and graphic in ways that high-altitude bombing was not. The sound of the .50 caliber machine guns became deeply embedded in pilots' memories and psychological processing of these missions. The guns produced distinctive audio signatures. The high rate of fire created a tearing sound, unlike slower-firing weapons. The 6 guns firing together from the P-51's wings produced a stereo effect with slight acoustic differences between left and right gun groups, and the harmonics of multiple weapons firing created rhythmic patterns that pilots learned to interpret. Experienced pilots could diagnose gun malfunctions by sound alone, could estimate ammunition remaining by the changing tone as belts fed through, and developed almost musical familiarity with their aircraft's armament. But the sound also carried psychological weight. It was the sound of dealing death to enemies who often could not effectively fight back, the audio signature of systematic destruction, and a reminder of the industrial violence that modern warfare had become. The .50 caliber ammunition itself represented American industrial capacity translated into aerial firepower. Each P-51 carried approximately 1,800 rounds total for its 6 machine guns, roughly 300 rounds per gun. This ammunition was manufactured to exacting specifications in American factories, producing millions of rounds monthly, transported across the Atlantic in the same supply ships that carried everything else Allied forces needed, and distributed to air bases throughout England and liberated Europe through logistics networks that functioned with systematic reliability. The ammunition mixed armor-piercing incendiaries, rounds designed to penetrate armored targets and ignite fuel or ammunition, with high-explosive rounds that detonated on impact. This combination was effective against a wide range of targets: locomotives, trucks, railway cars, barges, buildings, and aircraft on the ground. The American ability to provide this ammunition in quantities that allowed pilots to expend hundreds of rounds per mission, mission after mission, month after month, represented logistical achievement that Germany could not match even before Allied interdiction began destroying German transportation. The missions themselves followed established patterns refined through experience and systematic analysis of tactics and results. Fighter groups launched missions with specific target areas assigned: a section of railway line, a region of road network, a canal system. Flights of 4 aircraft operated semi-independently within these areas, searching for targets and engaging when found. Standard tactics emphasized approach from unexpected angles, often using terrain or the sun for concealment, engaging quickly before ground defenses could react, and departing the target area rapidly to avoid sustained anti-aircraft fire. Post-mission debriefings collected information about targets destroyed, damage assessment, enemy reactions, and problems encountered, feeding this intelligence into continuous tactical refinement and target planning. The effectiveness of these operations was documented through multiple sources. Aerial reconnaissance photographed rail lines, roads, and marshalling yards before and after attacks, providing objective evidence of destruction. German documents captured after the war revealed the transportation crisis from the enemy perspective, showing the desperate efforts to maintain supply movements despite overwhelming Allied air interdiction. German military commanders' situation reports increasingly emphasized supply difficulties, with units reporting critical shortages of ammunition, fuel, and basic necessities because transportation could not deliver supplies to frontline positions. The cumulative evidence was overwhelming. Allied fighter operations against German transportation had created logistical paralysis that crippled Wehrmacht military effectiveness, regardless of how well individual German units fought tactically. The human cost of these operations was significant on both sides. American fighter pilots flying ultra-low altitude missions faced higher loss rates than high-altitude operations. Ground fire, accidents, and pilot error caused steady attrition of aircraft and pilots. Many pilots who survived aerial combat against German fighters were killed in crashes or shot down during ground attack missions where a single lucky round from a German soldier with a rifle could penetrate the aircraft's cooling system and cause engine failure from which recovery was impossible at low altitude. The psychological toll accumulated as pilots watched squadron mates die in random accidents or sudden explosive destruction, as the mission's routine nature made death seem simultaneously random and inevitable, and as the grinding pressure of sustained combat operations wore down psychological resilience. German casualties from these attacks were substantial but difficult to quantify precisely. Locomotive crews, truck drivers, railway personnel, and soldiers traveling on trains and vehicles were killed in numbers that were never comprehensively documented amid the Wehrmacht's collapsing administrative systems. The attacks also killed civilians, railway workers, truck drivers, transporting military cargo under military direction, and occasionally truly innocent civilians whose vehicles were misidentified as military targets in the split-second decisions that low-altitude attacks required. These deaths received no monuments, no recognition, beyond brief notations in unit records or letters to families informing them that loved ones had been killed in air attacks. They were casualties of the systematic violence that industrial warfare inflicted on everyone within its scope, combatant and civilian, military-age males and children, and elderly, killed not through deliberate targeting of innocents, but through the logical consequences of waging total war where the distinction between military and civilian infrastructure had largely dissolved. By April 1945, when Callahan destroyed that locomotive in Bavaria, the Allied air campaign against German transportation had achieved decisive strategic results. Germany's railway system was in collapse, thousands of locomotives destroyed, tens of thousands of freight cars burned or damaged, major marshalling yards cratered by heavy bombers, and then systematically strafed by fighters to prevent repair crews from functioning. Road transportation fared no better. Truck parks were favorite fighter targets. Individual vehicles were hunted relentlessly, and fuel shortages meant that even surviving trucks often sat immobilized. The Wehrmacht's supply situation had deteriorated to catastrophic levels, with front-line units operating on ammunition stocks inadequate for sustained combat, armored formations immobilized for lack of fuel, and soldiers on reduced rations because food could not be transported from supply depots. This logistical strangulation contributed decisively to Germany's final military collapse. Wehrmacht units that might have continued resisting effectively in defensive positions found themselves unable to sustain combat because supplies could not reach them. Planned counterattacks had to be canceled because fuel could not be delivered to armored formations. Artillery fell silent because ammunition could not be transported forward. The German military's final weeks became a race between physical destruction by Allied ground forces and internal collapse from supply exhaustion, with both processes reinforcing each other as the Wehrmacht's coherent resistance disintegrated into isolated pockets, fighting without coordination, support, or hope of relief. The sound of American .50 caliber machine guns, that distinctive tearing roar that Callahan heard every time he engaged a target, became the audio signature of this logistical collapse. Across Germany in the war's final months, that sound announced the systematic destruction of transportation infrastructure, the interdiction of supply movements, and the practical demonstration that Allied air superiority extended from strategic heights down to treetop level. German troops learned to recognize the sound as warning of imminent attack, diving for cover when they heard the approaching growl of Merlin engines and the ripping sound of heavy machine guns opening fire. Civilians heard it and knew that another train had been destroyed, another bridge damaged, another section of railway rendered unusable. The sound communicated powerlessness, that the Luftwaffe could not protect Germany's heartland, that ground defenses were inadequate against low-altitude fighter attacks, and that military defeat was approaching regardless of propaganda promises about wonder weapons and final victory. Lieutenant Callahan survived the war, flying his final combat mission on May 5, 1945, 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. He returned to the United States with a Distinguished Flying Cross, an Air Medal with oak leaf clusters, and memories that would require decades to fully process. The exhilaration of low-altitude flying remained vivid, the sensations of speed and danger, the satisfaction of skilled piloting under extreme conditions, the camaraderie with squadron mates who shared experiences that could never be adequately explained to those who had not been there. The costs remained equally vivid, friends killed in crashes and shoot-downs, the violence he had inflicted on German transportation workers and soldiers, the moral ambiguity of missions that felt less clean than the aerial combat mythology of honorable duels between skilled adversaries. The P-51 Mustang he had flown became iconic in post-war aviation history, recognized as one of World War II's most significant aircraft and arguably the finest American fighter of the war. Museum examples and restored aircraft preserve the type's legacy, with their distinctive profiles and polished aluminum finishes becoming symbols of American air power. But the preserved aircraft were silent, their machine guns disabled, their engines running only for occasional demonstration flights. The sound they had made in combat, the Merlin engine's distinctive growl, the machine gun's tearing roar, the whistle of wind through gun ports, existed only in recordings and in the memories of those who had heard it, in contexts where that sound meant death, arriving at 400 miles per hour from angles that made defense nearly impossible. The strategic lesson remained relevant long after World War II ended. The systematic interdiction of enemy logistics through air power had proven devastatingly effective when air superiority allowed such operations to proceed with acceptable losses. Future conflicts would repeatedly demonstrate this principle, that military forces could be defeated through systematic destruction of their logistics as effectively as through direct combat. That air power could achieve strategic results by attacking transportation infrastructure, and that controlling the skies enabled attacks on ground targets that conventional ground forces could not prevent. The ultra-low-altitude tactics that Callahan and thousands of other fighter pilots employed in 1944-1945 became doctrinal foundations for close air support and battlefield interdiction operations, refined through technological advances, but fundamentally unchanged in recognizing that air power's greatest contributions often came from unglamorous, systematic destruction of enemy support infrastructure, rather than dramatic aerial battles. In the post-war decades, as veterans aged and historians analyzed the war's conduct, The contribution of fighter operations against German transportation gained recognition it had not received during the war itself. Strategic bombing of German industry had captured public imagination and generated enormous debate about effectiveness and morality. But the systematic strangulation of German logistics through fighter interdiction received less attention despite its decisive military impact. The missions were too numerous to recount individually, too routine to generate dramatic narratives, too focused on destroying locomotives and trucks rather than shooting down enemy fighters in dramatic dogfights. Yet their cumulative effect was strategic. They had crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain operations, had accelerated Germany's military collapse, and had demonstrated that air superiority could be translated into ground military advantage through systematic attacks on enemy logistics. The 50 caliber machine guns that had provided the firepower for these operations became symbolic of American military industrial capacity. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun was manufactured in enormous quantities during World War II, millions of weapons produced for installation in aircraft, vehicles, and fixed positions. The ammunition required was even more staggering, billions of rounds manufactured and distributed globally to American forces and allies. This industrial achievement, creating standardized weapons and ammunition in quantities that enabled their use with casual abundance, represented the systematic advantages that American industrial civilization possessed and that Axis powers could not match. Each 50 caliber round fired by Callahan and countless other pilots represented not just immediate firepower, but the industrial system that had manufactured the round, packaged it, transported it across oceans, distributed it to air bases, and loaded it into aircraft magazines, all done systematically, reliably, in quantities that made ammunition expenditure a tactical consideration rather than a strategic constraint. The sound of those machine guns tearing through German locomotives and trucks and railway cars in the thousands of engagements that comprised the transportation interdiction campaign was ultimately the sound of industrial warfare reaching its logical conclusion. It was the sound of overwhelming material superiority translating into military advantage, of systematic operational methods defeating improvisation and desperate expedients of an enemy being suffocated through the unglamorous but decisive tactic of destroying the logistics that enabled continued resistance. Most fundamentally, it was the sound of air power fulfilling its strategic promise, not through the dramatic knockout blow that pre-war theorists had imagined, but through the grinding systematic destruction of enemy capability to sustain military operations, attack by attack, mission by mission, day after day, until the accumulated damage made further resistance militarily impossible, regardless of the ideological fanaticism or tactical skill that individual German units might still possess. The Bavarian locomotive that Callahan destroyed on April 16, 1945, was one target among thousands attacked that day, one of tens of thousands destroyed during the campaign, one small component of the transportation infrastructure whose systematic destruction had crippled the Wehrmacht's logistics. The attack required perhaps 10 seconds of actual engagement, the approach, the burst of machine gun fire, the pull-up, and departure. But that 10-second engagement represented the culmination of enormous institutional efforts, the design and production of the P-51 Mustang, the training of pilots and ground crews, the logistics networks supplying fuel and ammunition, the intelligence identifying target areas, the command structure planning and coordinating operations, and ultimately the industrial civilization capable of projecting power across oceans and sustaining complex military operations far from home bases. The locomotive's destruction was a tactical event with strategic significance, another thread severed in the fabric of German military logistics, another contribution to the cumulative damage that was bringing the Third Reich to its final collapse. In the end, the reason P-51 pilots flew at treetop level, accepting the risks of ground fire and accidents, deliberately surrendering altitude advantage, operating in environments where margins for error were non-existent, was simple strategic calculation. With air superiority achieved, the greatest contribution fighter aircraft could make was systematic destruction of enemy logistics. This required low-altitude operations where targets were visible and where terrain masking allowed approach without early warning. The tactics worked because Allied air superiority was so complete that German air defenses could not prevent them, because Allied industrial capacity could replace losses while maintaining operational tempo, and because the cumulative effect of thousands of attacks was logistical paralysis that crippled enemy military effectiveness more decisively than any single dramatic victory could have achieved. The sound of 50 caliber machine guns at treetop level roaring across Germany in the war's final months announced this strategic reality to everyone within earshot. To Allied forces, it was the sound of systematic victory, of overwhelming advantage being translated into decisive results. To German troops and civilians, it was the sound of inevitable defeat, of transportation infrastructure being destroyed, of supplies that would never arrive, of military forces being slowly strangled by an enemy they could not effectively fight. And to the pilots who flew these missions, who heard that sound through the vibrations and acoustics of their cockpits, who watched their tracers tear into targets below, it was the sound of their job, dangerous, necessary, strategically decisive, and morally complex. That sound echoes still through historical memory, through museum aircraft and veteran accounts, through the documented record of what air power could achieve when properly employed and overwhelmingly superior, and through the enduring lesson that in industrial warfare, logistics matter as much as courage, that systematic methods defeat improvisation, and that the unglamorous work of destroying enemy supply lines can be more decisive than the dramatic battles that capture popular imagination.